It didn't begin with a scandal, it began with numbers. Cold, precise, and buried deep inside an official audit that was never meant to surface. But when those figures reached Queen Camilla's desk, insiders say the reaction was immediate and explosive. Because hidden within those documents was a financial trail that pointed not outward, but straight toward Princess Anne. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it was dismissed as routine, just another internal review buried within the dense and often impenetrable machinery of royal finances. These audits happen quietly, methodically, almost invisibly. Numbers are checked, accounts are verified, and reports are filed away without ever touching public consciousness. But this time, something didn't align. A figure that seemed too large. A transfer that appeared too carefully placed. A pattern that, once noticed, could not be ignored. According to reports, that single irregularity was enough to set off a chain reaction inside palace walls. What followed was not panic, but something far more unsettling. A quiet escalation. Senior aides, typically unshaken by financial complexities, were reportedly alarmed by the scope of what they were seeing. These were not simple accounting discrepancies. These were what some insiders have described as irregular allocations, tied to long-standing trusts that had existed for decades, structures so deeply embedded within the royal system that questioning them was almost unthinkable. And yet, the deeper auditors looked, the more questions began to surface. There are whispers that the review was no longer treated as routine. Instead, it was fast-tracked, moved swiftly through layers of bureaucracy that normally slow everything to a crawl. Documents were reportedly pulled from archives. Financial trails were retraced with unusual urgency. And before long, the findings reached a level of scrutiny reserved only for matters of the highest sensitivity. This was no longer just about balancing accounts. This was about understanding something far bigger and potentially far more destabilizing. Queen Camilla, according to those familiar with the situation, was briefed privately before any wider circulation of the report. That alone raised eyebrows. In a system where information is carefully distributed and tightly controlled, the decision to inform her early suggested the gravity of what had been uncovered. And while no official reaction was ever recorded, insiders claim the atmosphere shifted almost immediately. Conversations became more guarded, meetings more deliberate, and behind closed doors a sense of urgency began to build. Efforts were reportedly made to contain the situation, to keep the findings within a tight circle, to prevent speculation from spilling beyond palace walls. But in an institution as vast and interconnected as the monarchy, silence is never absolute. Information has a way of moving quietly, subtly, but persistently. And before long, fragments of the story began to leak. Not enough to confirm anything outright, but enough to suggest that something significant had been uncovered. And at the center of it all, unexpectedly, almost improbably, was Princess Anne. A figure known not for controversy, but for discipline. Not for excess, but for control. Which is precisely why the implications felt so profound. Because if someone like Anne was connected to this, then this wasn't just a financial anomaly. It was something far more complex. But what the audit revealed wasn't just about money, it was about control, legacy, and a royal system few truly understand. For generations, royal wealth has never been what it appears on the surface. Behind the public accounts lies a labyrinth of trusts, estates, and private arrangement structures so complex that even seasoned insiders struggle to map them. And within that hidden framework, Princess Anne had quietly built something no one was meant to question. To understand why the audit's discovery carried such weight, one must first step into the shadowed architecture of royal finance itself, a system that has evolved over centuries, shaped not just by law but by tradition, discretion, and an unspoken agreement that some things are simply not examined too closely. Publicly, the monarchy operates within clear boundaries. Sovereign grants, taxpayer-supported expenditures, and the visible revenues tied to entities like the Duchy of Lancaster or the Duchy of Cornwall. These are the figures that make headlines, the numbers that appear in reports, the ones that give the illusion of transparency. But beneath that layer lies something far more intricate and far less visible. Because the true foundation of royal wealth has always rested in private estates, generational trusts, and carefully constructed financial channels that exist outside the reach of public scrutiny. These structures are not new. They date back decades, even centuries, designed to preserve continuity, protect assets, and ensure that the monarchy remains financially insulated from political shifts. And over time, they have become so deeply embedded within the institution that questioning them is often seen not just as intrusive, but as disruptive to the very stability they are meant to uphold. Within this system, Princess Anne has long held a reputation that sets her apart. She is not seen as a figure of extravagance or excess, but as something far more formidable, a meticulous administrator. Someone who understands the machinery of the monarchy, not just on the surface, but at its deepest operational level. Reports have consistently suggested that Anne operates with a level of financial awareness that few others possess, navigating the intricate web of estates, trusts, and allocations with precision and control. And that reputation has, for years, placed her beyond suspicion. There have been whispers, coarse, subtle suggestions that Anne maintained a degree of financial independence that extended beyond the usual structures. But such whispers rarely gained traction. In a system where private trusts are both legal and expected, the line between standard practice and something more deliberate becomes almost impossible to define. What appears unusual to an outsider may be entirely routine within the institution. And that ambiguity has long served as a shield, protecting the inner workings of royal finances from deeper examination. The distinction between public funding and private wealth is crucial here. Public funds are regulated, documented, and, to an extent, accountable. Private trusts, however, operate under a different set of rules, ones that prioritize discretion over disclosure. They are designed to endure quietly, to move assets across generations without drawing attention, to function as a kind of financial backbone that supports the monarchy without ever becoming part of the public narrative, and because of that, they are rarely scrutinized. Not because they are hidden, but because they are accepted, which is precisely why the audit's findings felt so disruptive. Because it suggested that within this already complex system, there existed a structure that stood out not for its existence, but for its precision. A framework that appeared not just inherited, but carefully maintained, possibly even expanded. And if that were true, then the implications extended far beyond a simple financial review. It raised questions not just about how the system works, but about who truly understands it and who has been quietly shaping it all along. But this time, something slipped through the cracks, and it pointed to a structure far more deliberate than anyone expected. According to palace whispers, the moment of discovery came quietly, but its implications were deafening. A line item, easily overlooked, led auditors down a path they hadn't intended to follow. And what they uncovered wasn't just a discrepancy, it was a carefully constructed financial network tied to Princess Anne herself. At first, it seemed insignificant. Just another entry buried within a sea of figures, indistinguishable from the countless transactions that pass through royal accounts every year. But something about it didn't sit right. The amount was precise to precise. The classification was familiar yet slightly altered. And the origin point, that's where the questions began. Because as auditors traced the entry back, they found themselves navigating through layers that weren't immediately transparent. Accounts linked to trusts, trusts connected to legacy holdings, and each step deeper revealed not clarity but complexity. What triggered suspicion wasn't just the number itself, but the pattern surrounding it. Reports suggest that once the first irregularity was flagged, additional entries began to surface, each one subtle, each one easy to dismiss in isolation, but together forming something far more structured, a sequence, a system. And as that system unfolded, it became increasingly difficult to ignore the possibility that this was not accidental, that this was not a simple oversight, that this was in fact intentional. Tracing the flow of funds became a task of unraveling something meticulously designed. The money did not move directly. It passed through channels that appeared legitimate, routed through accounts tied to long-standing royal agreements, arrangements that had existed quietly for years, perhaps even decades. These were what some insiders have referred to as legacy allocations, financial provisions rooted in historical precedent, often left untouched out of respect for tradition. But here, they were active, moving, redirected, and that movement raised uncomfortable questions. Because while such structures are not unusual within royal finance, the way they were being used, if reports are to be believed, suggested a level of control that extended beyond passive inheritance. Allegations began to circulate that these funds were not merely preserved, but shielded, protected through legal frameworks that made them difficult to track, even harder to challenge. Structures within structures, layers within layers, each one reinforcing the next. Inside the palace, the reaction was far from unified. Some officials reportedly argued that this was standard practice, an example of how royal wealth has always been managed, quietly and efficiently, without the need for public explanation. Others, however, were less convinced. They saw something different, something more deliberate. And that difference in interpretation quickly evolved into tension. Because if this was routine, then why had it gone unnoticed for so long? And if it wasn't, then what exactly had been uncovered? As discussions intensified behind closed doors, concern began to spread among senior figures. Not panic, but unease. A growing sense that the situation, if misunderstood or mishandled, could have consequences that extended far beyond internal finances. Because this wasn't just about money, it was about perception, about trust, about the fragile balance that holds the institution together. And at the center of it all remained Princess Anne, silent, composed, and, according to those watching closely, entirely unshaken, which only deepened the mystery. Because if there was something to explain, she wasn't rushing to do so. And if there wasn't, then why did the structure appear so precise? And when those findings reached Queen Camilla, the reaction reportedly changed everything. Those present at the briefing describe a moment of rare, unfiltered reaction. Queen Camilla, typically composed, politically measured, was, according to insiders, visibly shaken. Because what she saw in that audit wasn't just financial, it was a shift in power she hadn't anticipated. The meeting itself, by all accounts, was not meant to be dramatic. It was scheduled as a controlled briefing, a quiet review of findings before any formal action was taken. But as the details were laid out line by line, figure by figure, the atmosphere reportedly changed. Those in the room describe a tension that built not gradually, but suddenly, as if the weight of the information had landed all at once. This was no longer a technical discussion. It had become something far more personal, far more political. According to whispers circulating among palace staff, frustration surfaced quickly. Not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable. Because what unsettled Camilla most, insiders suggest, was not simply the existence of the financial structure, but the fact that it had operated without her awareness. In an institution where information is power, and where influence often depends on access to that information, the idea that something so significant could remain undisclosed struck at the core of internal balance. It raised a question that lingered in the room long after the briefing ended. Who knew and who didn't? There are claims that Camilla pressed for clarity, asking how such funding pathways had remained outside broader visibility for so long. Not in accusation, but in disbelief. Because if the system allowed for this level of autonomy, then it also allowed for something else: independence. And independence within a structure built on hierarchy can quickly become a source of instability. The concern wasn't just about the past. It was about what this meant moving forward. Advisors reportedly attempted to contextualize the findings, pointing to the long history of private trusts and legacy allocations within royal finance. They emphasized tradition, precedent, continuity. But those explanations, while technically sound, did little to ease the underlying tension. Because this situation felt different, more deliberate, more contained, and perhaps more controlled than anyone had previously acknowledged. As the conversation unfolded, a deeper divide began to emerge. Openly, not in a way that would ever be acknowledged publicly, but quietly, through tone, through hesitation, through the careful choice of words. Some within the palace viewed the discovery as an overblown concern, a misunderstanding of systems that had always existed in the background. Others, however, saw it as something more significant, a moment that revealed just how much of the monarchy's inner workings remained beyond collective oversight. And in that divide, something shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to be felt. Because when trust is questioned, even subtly, it alters the dynamic between those at the top. It introduces doubt where there was once certainty. It creates distance where there was once alignment. And according to those observing closely, that shift marked the beginning of what insiders have since described as a quiet internal conflict. No declarations were made. No confrontations followed immediately. But the tone had changed. Conversations became more guarded, information more carefully managed. And beneath the surface, a sense of recalibration began to take hold, as if the institution itself was adjusting to a reality it hadn't fully recognized before. Because at the center of it all was Princess Anne, a figure not easily challenged, not easily questioned, and certainly not easily understood, which made the path forward anything but straightforward. But confronting the situation directly was never going to be simple, because Princess Anne was no ordinary royal. Princess Anne has never been a figure easily challenged. Known as the monarchy's hardest-working royal, her reputation is built not on spectacle, but on discipline, precision, and an unshakable commitment to duty. And those who know the inner workings of the palace say one thing clearly: Anne doesn't make mistakes when it comes to matters of structure. For decades, she has operated not at the center of public attention, but at the core of the institution itself, quietly, shaping, managing, and reinforcing the systems that keep the monarchy functioning. While others have drawn headlines, Anne has drawn boundaries. Her role has never been ceremonial alone, it has been administrative, strategic, deeply embedded in the day-to-day mechanics that most never see. Reports often describe her as someone who understands not just the rules, but the reasons behind them, and more importantly, how those rules can be applied, adapted, and preserved. That reputation did not emerge overnight. It was built over years of consistency, of showing up where others hesitated, of maintaining order where others saw complexity. Within palace circles, adherence to protocol is not optional, it is essential. And Anne, more than most, has been seen as its enforcer. Not through confrontation, but through clarity, through a presence that signals control without needing to assert it. Which is why the idea that something within her domain could be accidental feels, to many insiders, almost impossible. There are increasing whispers that the financial structure uncovered in the audit was not an oversight, but something far more deliberate. A system not only understood, but maintained with intention. Because if there is one thing consistently said about Anne, it is that she operates with a level of institutional knowledge that few can match. She knows the history, she knows the frameworks, and she knows how to navigate both without drawing attention. And that is where the tension deepens. Because if the structure was intentional, then it changes the entire narrative. It transforms what could be seen as a hidden irregularity into something else entirely, a strategic arrangement, carefully positioned within the boundaries of tradition. And that possibility carries weight, not just financially but symbolically, because it suggests a level of autonomy that exists within the system but is rarely acknowledged. Confronting someone like Anne is not simply a matter of questioning decisions. It carries political risk, symbolic risk, because she is not just a senior royal, she is, in many ways, a pillar of continuity. To challenge her is to challenge the system she represents. And within an institution built on stability, that kind of challenge is never taken lightly. Which is why, according to those observing closely, hesitation has become part of the response. Not avoidance, but caution. At the same time, the gap between perception and reality continues to widen. Publicly, Anne remains the embodiment of duty, steady, reliable, unwavering. Privately, however, the situation has introduced a new layer of complexity, a question that lingers beneath the surface, unspoken but persistent. Because if the structure was always there, then why is it only being noticed now? And if it was always understood, then who chose not to see it? The answers are not immediate, they are not simple, and they are certainly not unified. But as the narrative continues to unfold, one thing becomes increasingly clear: the story is no longer just about discovery. It is about interpretation, about intent, about the fine line between tradition and control. Which raises the question, was this truly a hidden secret or something far more calculated? Inside palace walls, there wasn't just one version of events, there were many. Some viewed the findings as a breach of transparency. Others argued it was simply the result of long-standing royal financial traditions. And in that divide, the real battle began not over money, but over meaning. What had started as a technical discovery now evolved into something far more complex, a clash of interpretations that cut through the inner circle of the monarchy. Advisors, aides, and long-serving insiders found themselves quietly aligning with different perspectives, each shaped not just by the facts, but by what those facts implied. Because in a system built on precedent, Interpretation is power, and suddenly the same set of numbers was telling entirely different stories. On one side were those who saw the audit as a necessary awakening. They argued that the findings pointed to a gap not necessarily in legality, but in visibility. That even within a system as intricate as royal finance, there should be a clearer understanding of how assets move, how trusts function, and who ultimately holds control. For them, this wasn't about accusation, it was about accountability. A belief that tradition should not exist beyond comprehension, especially in an era where scrutiny is constant and public trust is fragile. But on the other side stood a very different view, one rooted in history, in continuity, in the idea that not everything within the monarchy is meant to be fully transparent. These voices emphasize that private trusts, legacy allocations, and discrete financial channels are not anomalies, they are the foundation upon which the institution has sustained itself for generations. To question them, they argued, is to misunderstand their purpose, not secrecy for concealment, but discretion for stability. And from that perspective, the audit had not uncovered a problem, it had simply revealed a system functioning exactly as intended. This tension between legality and perception quickly became the central fault line. Because while the structures in question may well fall within established frameworks, the way they are perceived both internally and externally carries its own weight. Something can be entirely permissible, yet still provoke concern. Entirely traditional, yet still feel out of place when brought into the light. And that duality is what made the situation so difficult to contain. Beyond the palace, speculation began to grow. Quiet at first, then gradually more persistent. Media outlets, always attuned to even the faintest shifts within the royal narrative, started to circle the story. Not with confirmation, but with questions. Carefully worded reports. Subtle suggestions. Enough to signal that something was unfolding behind closed doors without ever fully defining what it was. And as those questions reached the public sphere, the pressure intensified not through direct exposure, but through anticipation. At the heart of it all were the legacy agreements themselves. Structures rooted in history, shaped by decisions made long before the current generation stepped into their roles. These agreements carry weight not just because of their legal standing, but because of what they represent: a continuity that links past to present, tradition to authority. And yet, in moments like this, they also become points of vulnerability. Because what was once unquestioned can suddenly become contested, not in its existence, but in its interpretation. Inside the monarchy, that realization brought with it a quiet sense of unease. Not panic, not disruption, but awareness. A recognition that if details were to emerge more clearly, the reaction might not be easily controlled. Because the public does not interpret tradition in the same way the institution does. And where the palace sees continuity, others may see opacity. Which is why the conflict remained largely unspoken, yet deeply felt. It wasn't about choosing a side, it was about understanding the implications of both. About navigating a narrative that could not be easily simplified, and a situation that refused to fit neatly into any single explanation. But as speculation grew louder, one question lingered above all: what would this mean for the future of royal unity? What began as a financial discovery quickly evolved into something far more delicate, a test of relationships at the highest level of the monarchy. Because in an institution built on hierarchy and trust, even the perception of imbalance can shift everything. The tension that had once been confined to documents and discussions now began to ripple outward, touching the very structure of royal relationships. It was no longer just about what had been. Uncovered, it was about how those findings were being interpreted, and more importantly, how they were being felt. Because within the monarchy, relationships are not simply personal, they are functional, symbolic, and deeply tied to stability. And when something threatens that balance, even subtly, the effects are rarely contained. There are growing indications that communication within the palace has become more measured, more deliberate. Conversations that once flowed freely are now filtered, shaped by an awareness that every word carries weight. Reports suggest that internal exchanges have become increasingly cautious, not out of fear, but out of necessity. Because in moments like this, clarity can be as dangerous as confusion. And so, the instinct is to control, to manage not just information, but the way it moves. At the center of this delicate situation stands King Charles III, navigating a position that is as complex as it is constrained. On one side, there is the weight of tradition, the need to uphold the structures that define the monarchy. On the other, the reality of shifting perceptions both within the institution and beyond it. And between those forces lies a narrow path, one that requires balance, restraint, and an understanding that any decisive action could carry consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Insiders suggest that this has placed Charles in a uniquely difficult position. Not because the situation demands a public response, it doesn't, but because it requires an internal one. A response that acknowledges the concerns without destabilizing the system. A resolution that preserves unity without appearing to ignore the underlying questions. And that kind of balance is rarely straightforward. Publicly, the silence remains intact. There have been no statements, no confirmations, no visible signs that anything is amiss. The monarchy, as it often does, presents a unified front, calm, composed, unchanged. But behind that exterior, the dynamic tells a different story, a quieter one. One shaped by careful navigation, by the unspoken understanding that not all tensions need to be visible to be real. The risk, however, extends beyond the present moment, because situations like this have a way of leaving lasting impressions not through what is said, but through what is understood. The perception of imbalance, once introduced, does not easily fade. It lingers. It reshapes how actions are viewed, how decisions are interpreted, how relationships are perceived. And over time, that perception can influence the very narrative the monarchy seeks to maintain. There is also the shadow of history. The monarchy has faced internal challenges before, moments where personal dynamics intersected with institutional expectations, where private tensions carried public implications. And while each situation is unique, the echoes remain. A reminder that even the most controlled environments are not immune to complexity. That unity, while essential, is not always effortless. And so, the story continues to unfold not through confrontation but through adjustment, through subtle shifts rather than dramatic moves, through a process that is less about resolution and more about recalibration. Because within the monarchy, change rarely arrives with noise, it arrives quietly, almost imperceptibly, until its impact is fully realized. And yet, the final chapter of this story may not be written in confrontation but in quiet resolution. In the end, there was no dramatic announcement, no official statement confirming or denying the whispers, just silence. But in the world of the monarchy, silence is rarely empty, it is often where the real decisions are made. As the tension that once pulsed quietly through palace corridors began to settle, something unexpected took its place, not clarity, not closure, but stillness. A deliberate stillness. The kind that signals not resolution but containment. Because despite the layers of speculation, despite the internal debates and the questions that refused to fade, there was no outward acknowledgement, no press briefing, no carefully worded release. Just the continuation of normalcy, as if nothing had ever shifted beneath the surface. And yet, insiders suggest that something had been addressed, just not in a way the public would ever see. There are reports, carefully phrased and never confirmed, that the matter was handled internally, quietly, strategically. That conversations took place behind closed doors, decisions were made in private. And whatever needed to be resolved was done so within the boundaries of the institution itself. No disruption, no exposure, just a recalibration that left no visible trace. But that silence did not erase the mystery, it deepened it. Because the absence of explanation creates its own narrative. It leaves space for interpretation, for speculation, for the kind of questions that linger precisely because they are never answered. And at the center of it all remains the same unresolved thread, the funding structure. Not denied, not explained. Simply unspoken. A presence that exists without acknowledgement, understood by some, questioned by others, but never fully revealed. This is where the monarchy's greatest strength and perhaps its greatest vulnerability becomes most apparent. The ability to control narrative not by shaping what is said, but by deciding what is not. Because in a world driven by information, silence can be more powerful than any statement. It allows the institution to maintain composure, to preserve its image, to move forward without inviting further scrutiny. But it also leaves behind something intangible, a quiet uncertainty that cannot be easily dismissed. There is, too, the matter of trust, not in the sense of legality or structure, but in perception. Because while the monarchy operates within its own frameworks, it exists within a broader public consciousness, one that increasingly expects clarity, even from institutions built on tradition. And when questions arise without answers, even subtly, they begin to shape that perception. Not dramatically, not immediately, but gradually, over time. And so, the story does not end with revelation or confrontation. It settles into something far more complex. A quiet understanding that within the monarchy, not every truth is meant to be spoken aloud. That some systems operate beyond explanation, not because they must be hidden, but because they are simply part of a structure that has learned to endure through discretion. What remains is not resolution, but awareness. A recognition that something was uncovered, something was considered, and something was ultimately contained. And while the full picture may never come into view, its outline is enough to suggest that the inner workings of the monarchy are far more intricate than they appear. Because within the House of Windsor, the most powerful truths are not always spoken, they are simply understood. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.